Hey Truth Seekers, and it's Nathanael here, continuing our strategy series on the different types of cards. And today we are going to be covering Sinnies. So just to start with, we're going to talk about how many different types of, or how many Sinnies that we can run. You can only run one of each Sinnie in your deck. All right? So you can't have more than one Sinnie of the same name in your deck. But due to ratios, you could run anywhere from a 50 to a 60 card deck. And you want to see your Sinnies because Sinnies help hinder your opponent from winning. So Carol and I, we typically like to run anywhere from 6 to 8 Sinnies in a deck. If we are using a strategy that primarily focuses on Sinnie, we like to run anywhere from 9 to 10 Sinnies. But if we're not focusing on Sinnies, then we typically like to just keep it at 8. 8 for 60 usually gives us about every 2 cards that we draw, we should see a Sinnie in our deck. All right. So to start with, we're going to talk about Sinnies that are just big, heavy defense. So these are Sinnies that have more than 10 defense. That's all they do. So you have Belligerent, who has an 11 defense, Toecrow is a 12 defense, and Grumble, who has a 13 defense. And then we go into our megas. So we have our original 3 megas, which is Zapper King Mega, Corrupt Terra Mega, and Scorch Mega. Okay, all 3 of these you can only run anywhere from 1 to 3 megas in your deck, but that also takes away from how many Ultra Animo you can run. So typically we like to run just 1 mega in our deck, but we also sometimes we'll run 2 megas or 3 megas depending on if we really want to utilize Ultra Animo. And quite frankly, worst case scenario right now, if you don't, you could just run Ultra Flow, run 2 Ultra Flow in a mega and still have the same ratios for your Sinnies. Because worst case scenario, Flow, you're just going to discard to go grab the Animo that you really do want to run. So plus, you can also use Flow to go grab your bigger Sinnies. Or any Sinnies, actually, because it just specifies Animo. Anyways, so all these guys have 16 defense, which is what megas are known for. Then we got 4 new megas. So we got Globster Mega, Nashtree Mega, Plantrap Mega, and Walrus Mega. They're all just 16 defense Sinnies. And then we got an interesting Sinnie, which is a new mechanic, which is Flipper. Flipper's a 7 defense Sinnie, which is like the second lowest kind of defense you can have. But has an ability that says if your opponent has 40 or more points, this Sinnie gets plus 10 defense by revealing this side, which makes it a 17 defense Sinnie. So these are all just your big Sinnies that you can run. Keep in mind that you can only run up to 3 megas, but that does take away from your ultras. So we like to run just 1 mega, as again, I just said. So we use Flipper to kind of help set that off, because this is actually bigger than the mega Sinnies. All right, moving on to our Sinnies that have of actions and abilities that have restrictions. First off, Kroggle. Kroggle is a 7 defense Sinnie that has the ability that says as long as this card remains your opponent's active Sinnie, they may not retrieve any cards from their discard pile. All right, and at 7 defense, he's not that great, but he does stop a lot of Faith decks because Faith likes to focus on recycling cards, either by adding them to their hand or drinking their power pool or their small group, and Kroggle just says they can't do that. Next up, you have Scorch and Scoffish and Evil and Anxiator. Okay, so these all have a similar action. This one says your opponent cannot activate Faith Animo on their next turn. This one says your opponent can't activate Hope Animo on their next turn. And Evil says your opponent can't activate Love Animo on their next turn. Anxiety says your opponent can't activate Story or Equipment cards on their next turn. So these guys have ability or actions that say on your next turn you can't do whatever they specify. Similarly, we have Zapper King. Zapper King is a Sinnie I believe should be in every deck because it can win you the game. Where these cards has the potential to do the same thing because they can't activate those Animo, but they do specify the kind that can't be activated. Okay? But this action says your opponent may not play any level 1 Animo from their hand into their small group next turn. Zapper King has a 9 defense Sinnie, pretty good. His action is really solid. Plus, holding onto this card and waiting for the opportune moment when your opponent doesn't have Sadie as a True Seeker or Paul's Chains, which are counters to Zapper King. Zapper King allows you to just hinder your opponent's entire turn sometimes. Sometimes once we see this, we're just like, oh, no, I can't play my turn. So keep that in mind. Next up, we have abilities such as Corrupt Terra. As long as Sinnie remains your opponent's active Sinnie, they cannot attach any equipment cards to their Animo. Ba Bubble. As long as this Sinnie remains active, your opponent may not have more than one Animo of the same name in their small group at the time. This hinders Stagnetic strategies, which they like to activate 3 Stagnetics in a single turn. I've actually caught myself in the middle of a game being like, oh, I actually can't play this card, so let me just take that back, because Ba Bubble is in play. Grump Roast says, as long as this Sinnie remains active, your opponent may not have any more than 3 Animo in their small group at a time. If 3 Animo in your small group, when this card is revealed, they must discard down to 3. So this one hinders your opponent's small group by reducing the number of cards they can have in their number of Animo they can have in their small group. This hinders Alex strategies and basically hinders everything else. Just to keep in mind that this thing that says that when he's revealed, if your opponent has more than 3, they have to discard 1. Ba Bubble works the same way. They just didn't have enough room to put that on there. So if your opponent has 2 or more Animo with the same name, they have to discard down to just 1 of those. Next up is Hippocritter. Hippocritter says, as long as the Sinnie remains active, the actions of your opponent's virtual Animo have no effect. So you can stop their actions, which is really strong. Now, just because you can stop their action doesn't mean their True Seekers aren't good. So, oh look, there's Screeny. Screeny says, your opponent may not use their True Seeker's ability while this Sinnie remains active. And basically, Screeny's just like, hey, go watch some TV or play some video games. Get on your tablet. And just hinders them from doing good things and using their abilities. Hookworm says, as long as this Sinnie remains active, all of your opponent's Animo require 1 extra universal cost in order to be activated. Hookworm has this ability that just stops your opponent in their tracks and adds an additional cost. So now their 3 cost 4, and that can kind of just ruin their turn sometimes. Judge Weed. As long as this Sinnie is active, your opponent may not reveal Sinnies. Judge Weed, I think, should be in every deck because the turn before you're going to win, you want to not be facing against any Sinnies. So use Judge Weed to say, as long as this Sinnie is active, your opponent may not reveal Sinnies. And then you have Deniala. Deniala says, as long as this Sinnie remains active, your opponent may not use their True Seeker's power. Screeny and Deniala go hand in hand, can't use their abilities, can't use their power. There's not a whole lot of cards that prevent your opponent from using their power. Denia is one of them, but these are all the Animo that are in the restrictive category. So these prevent your opponent from doing something or adds an additional cost for them to do something. So these are really good and helpful at hindering your opponent, just like Sin does in real life. Next up, we're going to talk about our hand control Sinnies. First off, we got Crasshopper. Crasshopper was from the character creation contest and did a great job. Has Coarseness. It has the action that says, when this card is played, your opponent reveals their hand, select 1 card, and have them shuffle it back into their deck. That goes hand in hand with Blinders. Blinders has the action that says, when the Sinnie is revealed blindly, at random, select 1 card from your opponent's hand and have them discard it. And then we have Murkay. has the ability, as long as this Sinnie is active, your opponent may draw no more than 2 cards during their draw phase, regardless of hand size. So this actually harms Sophia. So you play this on Sophia, it's during the score or the draw phase. So they draw the 2 cards for their turn, and then like, oh, Sophie's like, it's still during this draw phase. So like, I'm gonna draw 2 more, do Sophie's effect. Merkay hinders that. So they can't draw any more than 2. Once they've drawn their 2, it's it. Hand control. And then we have Rotten Wheeler. Rotten Wheeler is actually not that great. Rotten Wheeler says select up to 2 cards from your opponent's discard pile and add them to their hand. All right, so Rotten Wheeler can be good in certain circumstances. Say they've been discarding power cards because they have a full power pool. And, well, now you're going to go ahead and use Rotten Wheeler's Trash Talk to grab back power cards they've been discarding to their hand. So now they have power cards in their hand that they can't use, and it's going to prevent them from drawing cards that they can use. So Rotten Wheeler is not terrible, but quite frankly, if you're using the hand control strategy, I would stick with these 3 for right now, because drawing less cards and getting rid of cards from their hand is far more direct than just adding cards to their hand. Sometimes you can add Sinnies to their hand while you're facing against a Sinnie, and now they have 2 more dead cards in hand. But you just added Sinnies to their hand that they may want to use on you after you defeat that Sinnie. So Rotten Wheeler is kind of a toss-up. All right, next up we're going to cover Sinnies that deal with removal. Narcy. Narcy says, your opponent must flip over 1 Animo in their small group. They cannot activate or grow that Animo on their next turn. So it flips over and it stays like that. And then at the end of their next turn, they get it back. But Narcy's really good. It is a 7 defense, so it's not that great. Especially considering that another direct option that we have is Splitapidator. Splitapidator is one of the lowest defense Sinnies that we have currently. He has an action that says, when this card is revealed, your opponents must shuffle half of the Animo in their deck back into their deck, rounding up. So if they have 4 Animo, you shuffle 2 of them back. If they have 3 Animo, you shuffle 2 of them back. If they have 2 Animo, you shuffle 1 of them back. If they have 1 Animo, you shuffle 1 of them back. So Splitapidator actually removes Animo, but it is your opponent's choice, where Narcy is your choice. Okay, moving on to some more removals. We have Detestable. Detestable is a 10 defense Sinnie, and has the action that your opponent must discard 1 of their equipment cards that are in play. Being that we think that Paul's Chains is one of the best equipment cards out there, we use Detestable to get rid of Paul's Chains. And then we have Nastry. Nastry says, any Animo and all cards that are attached that remain in your opponent's small group following their next turn must be shuffled back into their deck. And then we have Fearcrow. Fearcrow has an action that says, choose 1 level 2 or level 3 Animo from your opponent's small group. Revert that Animo back into a level 1 by having your opponent shuffle the growth stages for that Animo back into their deck. And then we have Pandit. Pandit has the ability or the action that says select 1 special power card from your opponent's power pool and they must shuffle it back into their deck. And so these are the ones that affect Animo, affect equipment. And now we're going to talk about the ones that affect the discard pile. Plan Trap. You may select up to 3 cards from your opponent's discard pile and place them on the bottom of their deck. Your opponent just activated their 3 Stagnetics. You activate Plan Trap. You choose their 3 Stagnetics from their discard pile and put them on the bottom of their deck. Now they can't True Blue them or Shake and Break them. They are stuck with playing without them from their discard pile. And then Waspits. Waspits says, when this Sinnie is revealed, select 1 card from your opponent's discard pile and set it to the side. It may not return for the duration of the game. So, and that's also a 10 defense Sinnie. So these Sinnies are the ones that focus on removal. They interact by removing cards from your opponent's access. So they either remove them from their discard pile, remove them from their small group, remove a power card, Um, Sinnies are very powerful. And because of Pandit, you actually get use out of the Shield of Faith ability as well. Next up, we have our 3 Animo that focus on discarding cards from your opponent's deck. So one of the win conditions in this game that almost never comes up unless you're playing against a deck that draws a lot is once your deck runs out of cards, you lose. So we have Globster says, as long as this Sinnie remains active, as soon as your opponent must discard the top card of their deck as soon as their turn begins before drawing cards. So you might get 1 or 2 discards out of this, thinning out their deck. Pogo says, when this Sinnie is revealed, both you and your opponent must discard the top card of your deck. He's also an 11 defense Sinnie. And then we have Ichiena. Ichiena is like the worst out of these because it has an action that says, your opponent may shuffle any 1 card from their discard pile back into the deck. If they do, they must discard the top 2 cards of their deck. The reason why Ichiena is the worst one is, first off, they give your opponent a card back. There's a chance that they might discard it, but it's entirely optional. It shouldn't just not say may on it. It says your opponent shuffles any 1 card from their discard pile back in their deck. When they do, they must discard the top 2 cards of their deck. But Ichiena is a Sinnie that says, hey, are you going to give into these Ichiena ears? But as a result, he is optional, and mechanically in the game, that's not that great. But these are the Sinnies that you can use to help focus on your opponent discarding cards from their deck. Next up, we have our utility Animo. We have Provokupine and Wolf. Provokupine says, ability, when this Sinnie is defeated, the player who revealed the Sinnie may search their deck for any card and place it in their hand. He gets you any card that you need from your deck. If you like utility, Provokupine's pretty good, but he's a 7 defense Sinnie. Wolf, however, Wolf is a 10 defense Sinnie that has an amazing ability that says, if this card's in your hand, you may choose to show it to your opponent and shuffle it back into your deck. If you do, draw another card. So just take this into consideration. A 10 defense Sinnie, that instead of using it as a 10 defense Sinnie, you can just shuffle it back into your deck and draw a different card. Because even if you draw Wolf again, you can just reveal him again and continuously do that. And we've done that a couple times. Partially that's because the way I shuffle's bad. But Wolf is a very good card, and we are actually trying to run him in like every deck. So we try to run Zapper King, Wolf, and Judge Weed in all of our decks. And then we have other options of just trying to fill in the gaps with Omega, and then 4 other Sinnies that we think are good, like Flipper. We try to run Flipper in every deck too, so that gives us 3 Sinnies. But we've also been trying out different strategies with our Sinnies as well. And these utility Sinnies that actually help us progress in the game are really good. Next up, we are going to talk about Scornet and Walrus. You may be wondering why I have 3 of each of these out. And the answer is because these are Sinnies that you can run 3 of each. Where the general rule is you can only run Sinnies at 1 copy per name. Scornet and Walrus, you can actually run 3 copies of each. And that's because they have an ability that's similar to one another. Scornet says, if you have you may have up to 3 Scornet in your deck and play them on top of each other to create a swarm. The swarm has a defense of the sum of each Scornet, but only counts as 1 Sinnie when defeated. So the way that my wife and I use Scornet is that if we have Scornet and we have 2 more Scornets in our hand, we can play them all at the same time, and then we have 3 sixes, which is 18 defense Sinnie. Walrus is the same and says, you may have up to 3 Walrus in your deck and play them on top of each other to create a wall, which has a defense of the sum of each card. Each Walrus card in the wall counts as 1 Sinnie when defeated. So, he adds up all 8 of them together to make 24 defense. I'm pretty confident you have to have them all in your hand when you go to play them, and that if you have one and you reveal it to your opponent, you draw the other one, later on, you can reveal that one and place underneath of it too to increase its defense. But just the way it's written, it doesn't specify that. So I'm going to have to double check with the creators to see if they intend to just reveal what one walrus play and then search your deck for the other 2. I don't think it's played that because it doesn't mention searching your deck, and it just mentions play, so you play cards from your hand typically. So anyways, these are the Sinnies that combine. They are a fun strategy, and Carol and I might try and do this later on, but we're going to run cards that like Tough as Nails and other cards that search out for Sinnies, and use them to kind of collect them and then play them. Alright, and then our final Sinnie that we're going to be covering is Scorpoon. Scorpoon is a 12 defense Sinnie. He is actually really good. But he has it can be a good thing or a bad thing. He has an action that says, if you're not already facing a Sinnie, your opponent must reveal a Sinnie from their discard pile, if they have any, and play it against you. The reason why Scorpoon's really good is because towards the end of the game, if you have defeated 5 Sinnies, or if you're running Calvin and have defeated 4 Sinnies, your opponent does not want you to win by defeating Sinnies. So you reveal Scorpoon, and now suddenly Scorpoon says, hey, that Sinnie that you discarded because you didn't want to play it against me, play that against me now. So that way you can defeat the Sinnie and win by defeating Sinnies and not have to focus on points. However, most of the time, this is never the case. There are games where we get up to 4 or 5 Sinnies and we're discarding the 6th Sinnie, but most of the time, we're only playing against 4 Sinnies throughout the entire game, and our opponent just hasn't seen any more Sinnies against us. But Scorpoon's actually really good and very effective in our decks, just being a 12 defense Sinnie that we play early game when your opponent hasn't discarded any other Sinnies. So, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to a close. Just as a reminder, we like to run anywhere from 6 to 8 Sinnies in our deck. If we run a 50 card deck, we like to run 7 Sinnies, and if we run a 60 card deck, we like to run 8 Sinnies. And bare minimum, quite frankly, if you want to, you can run just 5 Sinnies in a deck. That way you never run the risk of revealing the 6th one. But then you're limiting your options, and you're not drawing as many Sinnies, because then for every 10 cards in your deck, you're only seeing 1 Sinnie. So, we're going to wrap that up. In the meantime, Truth Seekers, keep learning virtues and defeating Sinnies.